Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Michael Wilson, and I'm the webinar producer for KardasLarson. Today's session is Romance in the Workplace. We'll spend the next 40 minutes exploring how romance in the workplace can impact your organization and how you can build practices that will prevent disruption, legal exposure, and claims of harassment. Now for a few housekeeping notes. Everyone on the line is muted by default. There'll be a few polls during the course of our presentation, so please respond to them when you get prompted on screen. You can also utilize the question box to ask any questions of our presenters. You could follow KardasLarson on LinkedIn, and we value your feedback, so please take the survey that you receive tomorrow. That email will also contain a recording of this presentation. Now let's meet your presenters. Lisa Schipani and Lois Krause have spent many years helping organizations of all types and sizes to successfully develop and grow both their people and their businesses. Lois has a special expertise in labor law management, while Lisa's proficiency is in leveraging employee performance and development. Both of your presenters are committed to helping you maximize performance. Now I'll turn it over to Lisa to begin the presentation.
Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I'm going to talk a moment about what we're going to cover in the next 40 minutes, and thank you to Michael. So we're going to talk a little bit about the prevalence of romance in the workplace. We all know that it exists, and we also know that we can't stop it from happening. We're going to cover the possible effects on the workplace. And as we all know, if this isn't handled properly, employees can behave poorly and affect their colleagues. We're also going to talk about establishing a point of view. If your organization currently does not have a point of view, it truly is time to find one. And we're going to cover some best practices for managing workplace romance. There are practices that will make these situations more comfortable for all involved. Lois is going to kick us off today.
Thank you, Lisa. February, the Sweethearts Month. Wow. Do you notice many people in your workplace being more romantic at this time? What do these three, Barack Obama, Bill Gates, and Brad Pitt, have in common? All of them met their significant others at work. Boy, I wonder what their HR managers were thinking. Now for a true romance story. My grandmother was a secretary, and she married the boss, my grandfather. Things may not be the same today as they were then, but, well, come to think of it, they're not so different. Back then, my grandmother had to quit her job to be a housewife once they got married. So the romance was taken out of the workplace, but not until it had blossomed. And then my grandfather had to find another secretary. Well, we'd like to start off now and have you take a poll. We'd like you to tell us how your organization approaches romance in the workplace. Let us know if you have a formal policy, if you don't have a formal policy, if you're not sure if you have a policy, and if you're not sure if you have a policy, then I guess you aren't communicating so much. So, and you're considering putting a policy in place. Okay. So it looks like 40% of you have a formal policy. 60% of you don't have a formal policy. And none of you aren't sure whether you do or not, and nobody seems to be considering putting one in place at this moment. So let's discuss some statistics. It seems that almost 40% of all workers have admitted to having a workplace romance at one time or another during their career, according to the latest 2015 yearly Career Builder Romance Survey. Of that 40%, 33% of those romances ended in marriage. On the other side, 33% admitted to dating a supervisor or a manager. Ouch! I can see all those red flags all around. And I can hear the HR managers scheduling their sexual harassment prevention classes for managers right now. But please wait until we're finished with the webinar. But seriously, based on these statistics, we obviously can't prevent workplace romances, so we need to learn how to manage them. So let's take another poll. Why should you have a workplace romance policy? And you can check all of these that apply to you. Do you think it's to protect the organization from a harassment claim, to ensure that there's no favoritism or conflict, or to acknowledge that you can't prevent romance in the workplace? I'll give you a few minutes to check all that you feel are applicable. Okay. 86% of you feel that it's to protect the organization from harassment. And 86% of you feel that it's to ensure that there's no favoritism or conflict. And 71% feel that you want to acknowledge that you can't prevent romance in the workplace. These are all good points. So remember, we need to try and manage these situations to minimize liability for the organization, knowing these things will happen. Now, workplace romance could be a very benign thing if two consenting adults who are currently not married or in a committed relationship decide to date. It happens all the time. However, relationships often do not survive. Then, the organization has to deal with the fallout. Even if the romance does survive, there could be other pitfalls that need to be addressed. It is not the organization's responsibility to regulate personal matters, but if the personal matters invade the organization, it is your responsibility to keep the organization from liability. I worked with an organization once where the CFO and one of the top sales vice presidents had an affair. They were both married to other people, both excellent at their jobs. They tried to hide it from everyone, but were caught meeting at the airport when the sales VP was coming back from a business trip, and they were caught by the president of the company. They hadn't disrupted anything yet, but they were both fired on the spot by the president. I recommend that the handling of that was done improperly. I would not have recommended that at all, but it was done before I knew about it. So I just feel that there could have been another way to go. First, the possibilities of this type of relationship going downhill are far greater than they are being benign. If one or the other employee decides they want to end the relationship and the other does not, things can turn ugly. However, there is another possibility that many people do not think of. What if another employee feels as if they are working in a sexually charged, hostile work environment because they see two coworkers together, or believe they are being denied coveted work projects because there is favoritism? This can get very tricky. There are a lot of sides to this. Management could lose all of the employees' trust in them, even if they are not the employees involved in the romance. Having a dating policy can be very helpful if properly communicated to all. Everyone must know what is in the policy and what it should have, possible danger zones discussed. If two people are already married or in a committed relationship and decide to date, or one of the or the other is in a relationship, they need to know that any time the outside relationship affects the internal running of the organization, it could mean one or both of the dating workers could lose their positions. If the relationship grows and people get married, then they must understand the consequences of dealing with nepotism policy that may state no one can manage the work of a relative. which does not just mean a supervisor-employee relationship. It could be someone in a different department reviewing your work, like in quality or finance. Many organizations are large, and they can move people around to other locations. But sometimes that's not the case. One or both of the employees' whole livelihood may be disrupted. Lisa, why don't you elaborate on some of the best practices?
Thank you, Lois. Lois shared with you some of the challenges that certainly can exist when a workplace romance thrives or ends. We recommend that you truly play it safe and adopt some best practices in your organization. For those 60% of you that don't have a formal romance in the workplace or dating policy, we really recommend that you develop one for your organization. Having a policy and communicating it to your employees is a great start. And we all know that policies can be broken, and we're going to talk a little bit about policy offenders later. We also truly believe in encouraging disclosure. I recently worked with a CEO who said to me, Lisa, you can't legislate love, when trying to have him sign off on a workplace romance policy. His point of view, and a point of view that I've really adopted as I've moved forward, was to encourage disclosure and assurance that the organization will help the couple determine the best course of action so not to disrupt the workplace. Keep in mind, the lovers may be your top talent, and you don't want to lose them. Opening the lines of communication and determining the best course of action goes a long way and sets an example for others. If you think about Lois's story, how great might it have been if the folks were shown the respect by the organization for the fact that they had found each other, and then there was a determination on how the organization would move forward. Once disclosure has occurred, all parties can then look at the options, perhaps transferring to another department, maybe even helping one of the parties find a new role outside of the organization, or perhaps a change in responsibilities. And incidentally, the CEO that I worked with, he married his administrative assistant, so he understood romance in the workplace firsthand. Another best practice is consider a love contract. And according to SHRM's most recent workplace romance survey, only 5% of organizations ask those in a romantic relationship to sign a love contract, indicating that the relationship is consensual and the couple will not engage in favoritism or take legal action against the company if the relationship ends. The feedback on love contracts, though, is pretty mixed, with some HR professionals feeling that it provides a forum for discussion around workplace behaviors, and others feeling that these contracts encourage employees to hide their relationships. And again, as with most agreements, you can obtain signatures and someone can always start legal action in the end. A signed love contract may keep an organization from losing a case, although you'll still incur legal fees and possibly lost productivity from other employees. So the jury's really out in terms of the love contract, but it is something that is used. Providing harassment prevention training, and I'm confident that all of you out there provide this type of training in your organization. This is truly the foundation for ensuring that your employees know what will and will not be tolerated. And while many states mandate harassment prevention training for supervisors and managers, we believe that all employees in your organization should be trained, and we believe that it's not a one-and-done training. Constant, gentle reminders to your organization will be very helpful. Which leads me to our next recommendation, Valentine's Day. It's the perfect time to leverage your communication of your dating policy and even your anti-harassment position. One of my clients pulled me into a hostile work environment allegation which surrounded a workplace romance. Long story short, the employees didn't know there was a dating policy that did require disclosing to HR that this relationship was taking place. And yes, the policy was in the policy manual, and it was alluded to in the handbook. The employees were long tenured and not managers who frequently use the policy manual. So I recommend that you remind your employees annually with some sort of communication, maybe a lunch and learn around harassment, or a formal session regarding your anti-harassment posture. And this is a perfect place to include and remind people of your workplace romance policy. And again, what better time to do it than prior to the month of love? As I mentioned earlier, having a policy is good, and reminding employees of your posture annually is great. As we all know, there will be policy offenders. So for the 40% of you that have a formal policy about romance in your workplace, tell us how you handle policy offenders. And for the 60% of you that don't have a formal policy, may have something informal, let us know how you handle people who engage in a romantic relationship in your workplace. Take a moment to answer the question in the question box. Okay, I see a number of different strategies out there. Some of you do engage in transferring employees so that they're not working in that same type of reporting relationship, as well as some of you send people to relationship counseling, and that's interesting. I would imagine that your EAP could help you with that. And then I also see that some of you actually use a formal reprimand process, perhaps some type of warning. Okay, thank you for answering those questions. And we're going to move on. Lois has another story to close us out, and then we'll take some questions. And her story might possibly be the worst situation.
Thanks, Lisa. I don't think it was actually the worst, the totally worst one, but I worked with an organization that had a romance or dating policy, is what they called it. And they had a married couple working in 2 different departments. And one of the couple was having an affair with a 3rd employee in yet a 3rd department. As the affair heated up, the drama in the workplace did also. It got to the point where they were all using the organization's email and phone service to create havoc with each other. The outcome was that they were all called into the office of the HR director and were told to stop it, or they would all be discharged. It resolved itself shortly after that because 2 of the trio left the organization, but it wasn't soon enough. It caused chaos within the organization in all 3 departments and took valuable time away from managers, other workers, and HR just to handle the ever-escalating problems. So even with a policy, you may run into offenders that disrupt the entire organization. So remember, communication is key. So let's see if we can answer any of the questions that you have typed in along the way. And if you haven't already asked any, please do so by going to the question box and typing in a question.
Well, Lois, we've got one here from earlier in the session where you told the story about the CFO of the company and the senior vice president who were dating and got caught. And the question is, how would you have handled that? You mentioned that you didn't think it was handled the right way. How would you have handled that?
Well, Michael, thank you. I definitely wouldn't have fired them on the spot. First of all, they were actually both on their own time. They weren't on company time, even though he was coming back from a business trip. He was, coming back to the airport in the airport, and she was not on the trip with him. She just happened to meet him at the airport. And I think I would have counseled the president to call them in and find out what the situation was, and have a private discussion on how they were going to move forward, and give them the option of either ending the relationship because both of them were married to other people, or having one resign or the other, or something like that. I don't think I would have just fired them on the spot. I think the president probably left himself open for possible liability, but luckily for him, nothing came of it. They didn't try to sue for wrongful discharge, but I definitely would have not done that. I would have done an investigation first.
Okay. Lisa, we have a question I think that's good for your section, which is regarding best practices. So you mentioned that there's several different size organizations out there and that there may not be one answer that's best for everyone, but is there one succinct policy that you think all companies would benefit from?
Thank you, Michael. I absolutely think that all companies would benefit from having some type of policy in place. And in terms of what that policy looks like, I always feel that it's important to keep it simple so that people will understand it. And really, again, I really push for the disclosure perspective. And if I can just also comment a moment on Lois's situation, I was in a similar situation where a high-level executive was in a relationship with someone who indirectly reported to him in the organization, and they were traveling together, and people knew that this was going on. They were traveling together because the business required it. And we could have very easily fired both of them. They knew that we had a policy, and they knew that they needed to disclose. And what we actually did was bring them in and have a conversation with them and find out what was going on. And come to find out, the gal in the situation was planning to leave the organization, and wanted that to occur before she had to disclose anything. And it just didn't happen, and people knew that this was going on. So we actually helped her find her next role, and he stayed with the organization. And so that was a solution to a pretty sticky problem that we worked on together. So I definitely feel that disclosure needs to be a part of your policy and your practices, and I would say keeping them as simple as possible would also be key.
Okay, thank you, Lisa. One for Lois here, which asks, what happens if you have two people in a relationship, both having affairs, and one is a senior manager, owner, or partner in an organization?
Yes, that can be extremely sticky. I did come across this type of situation with one organization, and one of the people was a partner, and the other person was an employee. And it was a very, very delicate situation because you can't just fire the partner. He's a partner in the organization. And many times with a senior manager or an owner, you can't do that either. And basically, you have to make sure that the employee does not get discriminated against at any at any time in anything. And there needs to be some type of counseling, and this needs to be addressed. The partner or owner needs to have some type of possible relationship counseling, or maybe even be threatened with telling the spouse when they're having an affair. There could be different types of methods of having them come in and talk, but I think it has to be done at the partner or owner level first, and make sure that the employee is not harmed in any way, and while this gets resolved. The best thing is to counsel the partner, or to try and break off the relationship, or make sure that it does not get handled this way in the workplace and disrupt everything. But the key is to make sure that the employee doesn't get retaliated against or harmed.
Okay, thank you, Lois. Lisa, this one is sort of a clarification for one of your earlier points. Could you explain a little bit more about the love contract? If only 5% or so of organizations have them, why is that important, and why is it different than disclosure?
Thank you, Michael. Great question. Okay, so the love contract is actually a written document that the couple signs, saying that they will hold the company harmless if the relationship ends, and also it outlines the fact that they will not behave inappropriately from a favoritism perspective. And it is interesting that only 5% of the organizations have them yet. 80% of the HR managers that responded to this survey felt that they were important in beginning the discussion about how you have a relationship in the workplace, or how to handle that particular relationship, and can sort of aid to that disclosure and figure out how to move forward. My guess is that I would go back to my CEO, who does not want to legislate love. He would be totally opposed to a love contract. And again, the basis of his thinking and my thinking as I've matured as an HR professional is that, let's try and get people to feel comfortable disclosing, and to work on what the solutions are. And I'll just add that I met my husband at work. I was working in HR, he was in operations, and eventually we did disclose because a few people saw us places, and we actually ended up, I ended up leaving the organization, he stayed with the organization, but it even happens to us HR professionals.
And that touches on a point, perhaps for Lois, which was, is there a problem with two low-level company employees having a romantic relationship where there's not necessarily a supervisor lower employee relationship, but just two or lower-level employees?
Thank you, Michael. Well, it could be a problem. It might not be a problem. If they're lower-level employees and no one reports to somebody else, and they don't have to manage the work of each other, as long as their personal life does not interrupt the running of the business, I don't think there's a problem. But as Lisa stated, the open disclosure is the best way to go. People in the organization usually root for people that are, in love and going out, and as long as it's not impacting their job. So I think that as long as there's disclosure, and you have a discussion with the people on how they can handle the relationship without having any disruption to the organization, I think that is it's a great thing, and there really doesn't seem to be as big a problem. So unless, of course, they're, like I said, it's disrupting things. And then you have to look at it from a perspective of protecting the organization. So, but if either of the lower level employees are in a committed relationship or married elsewhere, that could be a problem, because usually, and it's just an affair, usually those things do not end well. And those are the types of things that you really need to address ahead of time and explain to them that things need to stay out of the organization.
So in terms of dealing with lower level employees, it's more about preventing disruption or distractions in the workplace than it is necessarily a legal liability like it might be with supervisors or higher ups.
Well, it could be a legal liability in the long run if one or the other decides to end the relationship. Then the other person can, if they feel jilted, can all of a sudden claim sexual harassment. So that's why Lisa's idea of disclosure is very good. It just says that, you know, you're disclosing that you're in this committed relationship voluntarily, and it can help you in the long run, even though it might cost you some, you know, legally it might cost you some money to defend a case. But if, you know, everybody knows that you have a policy of disclosure and these people are, you know, disclosed, it goes a long way to helping mitigate those possible problems when the relationship ends, if it ends poorly.
So Lisa, if someone really doesn't want to have too many policies to deal with, can they just use their sexual harassment prevention policy in place of some of the things you've talked about today, or do you really need a separate love contract or dating policy?
My recommendation is that you do have two separate policies, because I think you know, they could fall under the umbrella of harassment, but I really think it's more prudent to have two different policies, because harassment, I think, is a number of additional issues that you need to address in your policy. But I think the way that you handle them is very similar. When you have a sexual harassment allegation, you conduct an investigation. When someone alleges there's something romantic going on, conducting an investigation rather than immediately firing the two people certainly makes more sense. And then, you know, Lois touched on the nepotism policy as well. And in some companies, you do have these types of relationships are welcomed, and then you need to have a posture on, okay, so the romantic relationship has escalated, the couple has gotten married, what does that look like in my organization? Are they allowed to be in the same pyramid, or is that going to create a problem? So do I need to move them around? I have another organization that I worked with recently where, believe it or not, there were some cases of direct reporting relationships. There was a head of a manufacturing facility, and his wife was the HR manager. That is something that I would not suggest, but sometimes those things happen depending upon the posture of an organization. And what's interesting, what really hurt, is they both decided to leave the company at the same time. He was definitely a very talented individual that they didn't want to lose. They were fine with losing his wife, but they sort of came to the organization as a package and left the organization as a package, and it left a really big talent and knowledge void in this manufacturing organization. And I would say that is not a position that you want to be in when you have a husband and wife in a reporting relationship. And I always ask myself, why would I want to work with my husband and then come home? That obviously is a personal choice, and organizations have have to consider what that effect is on the organization, as Lois talked about, having favoritism, disruption in the workplace. That all takes a toll on your productivity and prevents you from maximizing your performance.
Thank you, Lisa. Lois, one last question. In your story about the love triangle, why is it that everyone didn't get fired immediately? What caused the holdup in that story?
Well, when they all got called into the HR director's office, each one of them worked in a different department, and each one of them had some fault in bringing the personal into the workplace, but two of the three had more fault than one of the other ones. One of the other ones was more of a victim, and to just fire all of them would be really not a fair thing to do. So they just decided to tell everybody they would give them another chance. There was a reprimand put in everybody's file, and they were told that if it didn't stop, that they would all be gone. And they did stop the the uproar and the chaos. And then soon after that, two of the three decided to leave the organization, which was very, very helpful. And there had been talk about two of them leaving ahead of time. So it was another one of those things where these are people's lives we were talking about, and you didn't want to devastate everybody, especially the one that was more of a victim than the other. So every individual situation needs to be looked at independently. Yes, you have rules and regulations. Yes, you have a policy. Yes, you address it and try to treat everybody equitably, but you need to have some type of independent thinking, and the different circumstances come into play when you're doing an investigation and you're doing a relationship counseling. So that was why they waited.
Okay, thank you, Lois. And thank all of you for attending this KardasLarson webinar. We encourage all of you to follow KardasLarson on LinkedIn to receive information on future webinars, compliance updates, and our speaking engagements. And please be on the lookout for an email tomorrow that'll contain a survey to ask how we did today, along with a recording of this presentation. And we'll now be signing off. Thank you.